blusaf, they can wear an elite. Sales and soga and himsilfer haf. Blood and blesser and eikberger jenikt.
Wēsaþ hale und bēoþ wilcuman to meinem Wyrdwayz. Welcome back to part 5 of this episode about the Anglo-Saxon rune Wen. Now I'd just like to start by thanking all of my subscribers. I really do appreciate your support. If you've just found this channel, then welcome, and please subscribe, please hit the like button, it's very much appreciated. And if you're feeling so inclined, please share this video so that we can get it out to more people. Now, I am on a one-woman mission to show that the heathen Anglo-Saxons were every bit as interesting, as spiritual as their cousins, the Norse. Unfortunately, in England, many heathens look to only the Norse culture, and they don't realise that the Anglo-Saxon culture is every bit as rich and interesting and deep and spiritual as that of their Norse cousins. So please, as I said, I really appreciate your support. Please like, please share, please comment. I love to read your comments. I also have a Patreon that you can support if you feel so inclined, and of course you can buy me a coffee. Thank you. I think I need one today. I'm out in the woods. It's almost December, and it's a lot nippier than when I was filming last time. The world has certainly changed, and I'm sat here amongst a beautiful carpet of brown and gold beech leaves. It's quite beautiful today, and actually not that cold, but I've still got my cloak on. It's cloak weather now. So I have already spoken a lot about this rune of Wen, the rune of joy, and we've looked at both the joyful aspects, and we have looked at the flip side, the not so joyful aspects, the things that the Anglo-Saxons didn't want to experience. And I continue in that vein today, because today I am going to be talking to you about slavery. Now, when I first started considering the Anglo-Saxons, certainly slavery was not something that instantly jumped to mind. Slavery is an extremely ugly subject, and so it's only natural that people would wish to avoid it. But the thing that staggered me was that around 30% of the Anglo-Saxon population were slaves and were in slavery. Now that is actually a huge figure, so it goes to show that slavery was very much part of the Anglo-Saxon lifestyle. With so many people being in slavery, it just goes to show what a huge aspect of Anglo-Saxon livelihood it was. Now I'd like to start, as I often do, by reading to you from Tacitus, who wrote this in around AD 98 when referring to the Germanic tribes on the continent, and he tells us something of slavery in that time amongst the Germanic tribes who lived there. So this is what Tacitus had to say. Slaves in general do not have particular duties about the house and estate allotted to them as our slaves do. Each has control of a holding and home of his own. the master demands from him a stated quantity of grain, livestock or cloth, as he would from a tenant. To this extent, the slave is under an obligation of service, but all other duties, including household work, are carried out by the housewife and her children. To flog a slave or to punish him by imprisonment and hard labour is very unusual, yet to kill one outright is quite common. But they do this not as a strict enforcement of discipline, but in a fit of passion, as they might kill an enemy, except that they do not have to pay for it. Freed men rank little higher than slaves. They seldom have any influence in a household, never in the state, except among the tribes that are ruled by kings. There they rise above free men and even above noblemen. Elsewhere, the inferior status of freedom is a proof of genuine liberty. So it would appear from this statement from Tacitus in AD 98 that slaves were commonplace amongst the Germanic tribes on the continent, but they weren't regarded in the same way that slaves were within Roman society. Now, of course, we know that within the Roman world, slavery was an extremely important aspect to them and effectively propped up and supported the economy. And of course that would have been the case in all parts of the Roman Empire, including Britain. The dogs are here. Now the Romans were quite fond of manumitting their slaves, of letting them come out of slavery. And that meant that the pool of slaves, the slavery pool, if you like, needed to be constantly topped up with fresh slaves. So before the connection with the Roman Empire, it's quite likely that the Germanic way would be, at the end of a battle, any survivors would simply have been slaughtered. You know, the defeated foes would have just simply been killed. All the males, all the adult males, that was them gone. But what happened was there was a shift, and the Germanic tribes started, rather than just outright slaughtering, they started enslaving their foes, their defeated foes at the end of the battle, in order to trade with the Roman Empire. You know, the Romans were always looking for fresh slaves, and this was a great way for the Germanic tribes to actually trade with the Romans through slaves. Therefore, it stands to reason, but by the time the Germanic tribes migrated across the North Sea into Britain, that they were very familiar with the concept of slavery. And also, of course, the Romano-British people that were already here were also extremely familiar with the concept of slavery, having been under Roman occupation for so long. And I think it's a guarantee that many of the Romano-British people did end up being taken into slavery by the migrants that came into Britain. Now, we only have to look to the Old English language to see how many words there were within this language which meant slave or slavery. There are literally loads of them, which shows and reinforces what an important part of their society that there was. So words for slave, we have theau, need theau, haft enkel, or enchel, depending on where you lived and whether you pronounce C as a hard C or a soft C. We have wheel, theauling. We have theo, theau, and fral. So these are all words in the Old English language which basically just mean slave. Now we have a few words which specifically mean a female slave. We have weala, theo, and litla. They all mean a female slave. We have some words which mean a young slave, which presumably, if you're going to have a slave, a young slave is the best type to have. Theo winchel, and willinchel. They both mean a young slave. Now here are a few other words which just go to reinforce what a very dominant part of society this was. We have bēoþ, which is a slave who works. Presumably they all did. We have a koperknecht or a keperknecht, both of which mean a bought slave. Interesting, I'm fairly sure that the word knecht actually means boy as well. So just remember, next time you are feeling sorry for yourself, it could always be worse, because the Anglo-Saxons had a word, thealboren, which means slave born. So if a slave had a child, the child was automatically a slave. That really sucks, doesn't it? None of this is good. We have the word inbeerdling, which is actually a noun to describe someone who was a slave born in a master's house. So again, if you were born into slavery, that was your fate sealed. We even have this word, which is most probably a derogatory term for a poor slave. You know, this poor person, thealwetling. So that was a derogatory term for a poor slave. Now we have a couple of verbs as well. We have yetheowian, which is a weak class 2 verb, which means to enslave. And we have theowian, which means to serve, to be a servant or a slave. So absolutely loads of words. The Old English language is simply chock-a-block with words which are about slavery. So really, when we consider that approximately 30%, a huge number of the Anglo-Saxon population were enslaved, it is hardly surprising at all that they had so many words about slavery. You know, and the evidence for Anglo-Saxon slavery, it spans right the way through the period. So there's evidence from 587, when it appears in the law codes of Athelbert, King of Kent, right through to the time of the Domesday Book, once Norman occupation had begun. So it was such an inherent part of society. And in fact, what we need to consider is that the slave population would have supported the economy. It would have propped up and supported the economy to make the rich people richer, the elite people. It would have served them and only them. So really, in Anglo-Saxon society, buying a slave would be no more unusual than us buying, I don't know, a TV or a cooker or anything. It was so commonplace.
Eile wolfruna, hoefdale sto, eile lay of yifu, ich fairly well, thank ye of they, and so ich good, thank ye of they, knowinga, water each new and theo. Eile. Yes, he is sweeter strlang. Strlang, good. Through thunder, teal, wheel. Yeah, short, ach, mayen fast. He have fair hair, he is young und sweeter klaarvlieg. Ich glad. Eila, thu et afchleithi. Meanwhile, that is wood. Ich ga sellen. Thu canst? Wood oxa. He is edeljon. Grady. Gram. Und sweeter wood. he shall gan, forth rather. Wala wa, he shall gan. Ich verf sellen hina. Ich wheeleth on hina to London wichem. Ich shall finden Frisian chiapen. Ich can Frisian knappen. He hat a legband. So scherb sprechen mit him. Lay of Yifu, ich wheeler.
So let us now consider how one would become a slave. How did you end up as a slave in Anglo-Saxon society? Well, unfortunately, there were quite a number of ways that you could end up in this sorry state. Now, of course, we know that during the conquest of Britain, quite a number of the native people would have ended up in slavery, taken into slavery by the new migrants, the new domineering migrants that came from the continent. But the enslaving of humans did not stop once the land had been conquered. It didn't stop then, because the Germanic tribes were not at all shy about preying on each other. They didn't really care. They had no qualms about enslaving fellow Germanic people. Now, as I've mentioned many times before, this migration period, this time when this country was being taken by the migrants, and there was lots of shifts, and it was an extremely turbulent, violent time, and the tribes were constantly warring and fighting with each other. Now, as I mentioned earlier, on the continent it was not uncommon for the defeated foe to be enslaved, and this also happened amongst the tribes when they were settled in this country. Now, we have some evidence for this in chapter 22 of his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, or Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. Bede, or I probably should call him Beda, that's probably how they would have pronounced it, tells the story of one of the king's retainers by the name of Immer. Now, Bede or Beda tells us this story. He tells us it because it concerns a rather wonderful, miraculous event which helped to reinforce the glory of Christianity, which is why he tells us this story. But we can actually extract some information from it to tell us more about slavery. Now, Immer, he had a brother called Tunna, who was a priest and the abbot of a monastery. Now, Immer basically was involved in a battle which happened in 679 against the Mercians. But basically what happened was Tunna, he believes that his brother Immer has been killed in this battle. He goes to the battlefield, he finds a body which he believes to be his brother Immer, and he takes it back to his monastery, where he basically buries it and offers many masses for his brother's soul. Now, the result of this, according to the story, is that nobody is able to fetter Immer, who lives. And that is the point of this story that Bede, or Beda, tells us. So anyway, let's go back to the points that I want to extract from this story, which tell us more about slavery, shall we? So Immer was wounded and left for dead, and Bede tells us that Immer was struck down amongst others. He lay all that day and the following night as though dead amongst the bodies of the slain. But at last he recovered consciousness, sat up and bandaged his wounds the best he could, Then, having rested for a short time, he rose up and set out to find friends to take care of him. But as he was doing so, he was found and captured by men of the enemy army and taken to their lord, who was a Wēsaþ of King Athelred. In case you're wondering, a Wēsaþ is basically a follower, a companion of a chief or a king, a Wēsaþ, in case you want to remember that word. Where was I? On being asked who he was afraid to admit that he was a thane. But he answered instead that he was a poor peasant and married, and he declared that he had come to the army in company with other peasants to bring food to the soldiers. Now, after being in the company of his enemies for some time, through observing his manners and his way and his demeanour, his captors come to realise that he isn't a peasant at all, and that he has a much more thanely bearing. Now, he's questioned by the Wēsaþ, and he does eventually admit to being a thane. Now, when he finds this out, the Wēsaþ says to him, "I realised by every one of your answers that you were not a peasant, and now you ought to die, as all my brothers and kinsmen were killed in the battle. But I will not kill you, for I do not intend to break my promise." So once Immer has recovered from all of his injuries that he sustained in the battle against the Mercians, the Wēsaþ sells him to a Frisian slave trader in London. Now, I may have told you before that I am actually descended from Frisians. My paternal DNA originated in Frisia. So my ancestors were in fact well-known traders. The Frisians were middlemen. They would sell anything, and they didn't stop at selling slaves. They did not care about trading in humans. They had no qualms with this. They had various trading posts in Britain, and in fact every single one of the Anglo-Saxon skiats, the coins that my mum has found with her metal detector back on my family's farm in East Anglia, they have all originated in Frisia. There were very strong links between the Frisians and the East Anglians. Anyway, so from this story about Immer, what we can deduce from the evidence is that the fate of higher ranking elite thanes, retainers, would at the end of the battle most probably have been death. However, the lower ranking, the peasants, the poorer people, the not so important people, they would most probably have been enslaved. And that is the reason why the Wēsaþ does not kill Immer, because he has made a promise to him and he honours that promise and sells him to a slave trader. He does eventually get free because of his wondrous powers not to be fettered. Anyway, this really does hark back to the traditions of the Germanic tribes on the continent, who at the end of the battle would kill every male adult. All pretty gruesome, really. So, one way of becoming a slave was to be a prisoner taken at the end of a battle. But there were so many other ways that you could potentially lose your freedom in Anglo-Saxon times. Now, being caught for certain crimes was a surefire way to end up as a slave. Now, post-Christian conversion, if you were caught for removing a monk from his monastery, slavery. You're going to end up a slave. But there are lots of other sins that could also get you put into slavery. Now, you may remember from part 3 of my episode how I told you that the last thing you wanted to get caught for doing in Anglo-Saxon times was fornication. Again, fornication was another reason that you could end up in slavery. If you weren't put into slavery, you could end up having to fast for many years for fornication. Now, you could also end up in slavery through debt. Now you may recall, it depends how good your memory is and whether you've watched these videos yet. If you haven't, please do. You may remember from part 2 of the episode that I told you about what Tacitus had to say on the subject when referring to the Germanic tribes on the continent in AD 98. I'll read it to you again. They play at dice, surprisingly enough, when they are sober, making a serious business of it, and they are so reckless in their anxiety to win, however often they lose, that when everything else is gone, they will stake their personal liberty on a last decisive throw. A loser willingly discharges his debt by becoming a slave, even though he may be the younger and stronger man. He allows himself to be bound and sold by the winner. Such is their stubborn persistence in a vicious practice, though they call it honour. Slaves of this description are disposed of by way of trade, since even their owners want to escape the shame of such a victory. So, Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic people, stubborn beggars. Now I know where I get it from. So yes, they would even willingly sell themselves into slavery in order to win a bet. Believe it or not, you could end up becoming a slave thanks to your family. Indeed, a father could sell his son or his children into slavery up to the age of 14. After this time, presumably, they had to give their permission to be sold into slavery. So there were a number of ways that you could end up as a slave: through military conquest, through crimes, including removing a monk from his monastery, or the dreaded sin of fornication, through debt, or indeed by being sold into slavery by your family. Now that last one may sound really, really, really bad to us, but we mustn't forget that they lived in a scarcity subsistence economy. And it could have been a desperate parent's way of ensuring that their children didn't starve, because if they were a slave, they were going to have to be provided for by the master. We mustn't forget that times were very, very, very different, and attitudes towards such things were very different. So now we know that there were in fact a multitude of ways that you could fall from being a very high rank person to being a slave. Let's have a look at some of the physical differences between a high status person and a slave. Now, contrary to popular belief, slaves didn't walk around wearing sackcloth. That wasn't the case at all. Now, I have no idea how this high-ranking woman managed to fall from an elite position down to one of being a slave. We can only speculate, but let's have a look, shall we?
So here we meet our high status pagan Anglo-Saxon woman, and as you can see, she's wearing some rather fetching bow brooches, holding her amazingly gorgeous glass beads across her chest. Aren't they just deliciously amazing? And her dress, which she's rather proud of, dyed with madder, is held with a rather amazing belt, and she's wearing these girdle hangers that represent her status and a knife to show that she's a free woman. So there she is in her rather beautiful gown, and we're going to turn her into a slave. I don't know if she knows this yet. We're going to turn you into a slave. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, we are. First thing to do is to ditch the colour. So slaves, they wouldn't have worn sacks, but they wouldn't have had dyed clothes. So here we can see her rather beautiful red dress has been replaced with a plain undyed dress. But yes, she's still got her bling on and her belt. And I'm sorry, my love, but that's going to have to go. Yeah, even the beads. I know you love the beads, I know, but yeah, first thing to do is to get rid of the girdle hangers, because you don't have possession of a home, so they've got to go, I'm afraid. And you're doing your belt up. Why? You can't wear that belt. Slaves wouldn't have had that fancy tablet weave. That's got to go, I'm afraid. Okay, have a strop. See if I care. And here we have a much more simple belt based on a find from Blacknellfield. 2 very simple iron rings that the belt would have been fastened with. So yeah, that's right. I know it's not as fancy as your tablet weave, but it's going to have to do. You're a slave now. Get that on. Yep, that will do. Okay, everything in place. Good. So you still seem to have your... Yeah, I know you love the beads. I love the beads too. I feel your pain. But they are going to have to go, I'm afraid. Thank you. Right, okay, so the beads are gone, the brooches are gone, there's no tablet weave, we're looking very, yes, very plain, I know. Oh, you've still got some beads around, they're going to have to come off, please. No bling. This is a bling-free zone. Okay, so you're pretty plain, but, I mean, look at your hair. Your wild, crazy, Frisian curls. It's really not very practical, is it? I think we're going to have to sort... Yes, we're going to have to sort the hair out. Thank you. Okay, so we've got a much more practical style now. The hair's plaited up. It's good for... Yes, I know. Yes, I know your face is dirty. But we are looking much more like we're ready for work now. Yes, dirt on your face. That's known as hard work, I'm afraid. It will wash off. So here we see our conversion from high class status lady to slave.
So if you were unlucky enough to end up as a slave, where would you end up? Now we know that the slave trade on the continent was absolutely rife, and again we can look to Bede's or Beda's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, where we hear a story about Gregory the Great, who encountered some slave boys whilst in Rome, who were from the Angli tribe, or the Angles. So let me read that to you. It is reported that some merchants, having just arrived at Rome on a certain day, exposed many things for sale in the marketplace, and abundance of people resorted thither to buy. Gregory himself went to the rest, and among other things some boys were set to sale, their bodies white, their countenance beautiful, and their hair very fine. Having viewed them, he asked, as is said, from what country or nation they were brought, and was told from the island of Britain, whose inhabitants were of such personal appearance. He again inquired whether those islanders were Christians, or still involved in the errors of heathenism, and was informed that they were heathens. Then, fetching a deep sigh from the bottom of his heart, "Alas, what pity," said he, "that the author of darkness is possessed of men of such fair countenances, and that being remarkable for such graceless aspects, their minds should be void of inward grace." I don't think he liked heathens. He therefore again asked what was the name of that nation, and was answered that they were called Angles. "Right," said he, "for they have an angelic face, and it becomes such to their co-heirs with the angels in heaven." That's Book 2, Chapter 1. Yes, indeed, it has to be said, us Angles do have rather angelic faces, don't we? Maybe not. Okay, so moving on. So we know that the English slaves were sometimes shipped off across the sea to be sold on the continent where there was a good slave trade. Now, slaves could be troublesome assets, so surely shipping them off to another country where you could trade them for items that you couldn't buy in this country was a good idea, yes? Well, there were, however, some people in England who believed that English slaves should not be exported abroad. Now, if we look to the laws of Inn's laws, which I've spoken about before, written around 694, we hear that the sale of a fellow countryman across the sea, even if he was guilty, was not allowed. But clearly it did happen. We know it did happen from the account about Gregory the Great. Plus, of course, one of the most famous English slaves ever was Bēoþ, who lived in the 7th century and who was married to King Clovis II, the king of Neustria, since the age of 5. He was the king of Neustria since the age of 5. Anyway, what we do know about Bēoþ was that she was of Saxon descent and had arrived in Francia from lands across the sea, meaning that she had to have come from England. She was sold at a very low price to the mayor of the Franks, Erchinoald, and Erchinoald, well, he rather liked her. He favoured her quite a lot. Presumably she was a looker, because she's been described as being beautiful, slender, dignified and pious. And he wanted to marry her, but she managed to avoid that. Anyway, she did end up marrying King Clovis II, and she was the mother to 3 future kings. Before she then retired and set up a very large nunnery at Chelles near Paris. Now, one of the important things about Bēoþ with regards to slavery is that she made it illegal for Christians to be kept as slaves and traded in the kingdom of Neustria, and she personally paid for many slaves to be freed, many slaves from England to be freed, which presumably she then ushered them into the monastic life. So what was the church's attitude to slavery in England? Because to me, to my modern mind, slavery is bad, very immoral. But obviously, as I've said, times were very different then, and that was not the attitude held by the church. Their attitude was fairly nonchalant, to be honest. There's no evidence at all to say that the church opposed slavery. The only thing that the church didn't like was slaves being sold abroad, because then they could fall into the hands of dirty heathens and be lost from Christ's flock. So yes, slaves good. Selling slaves onto the continent where they could end up with heathens, bad. Okay, so that was basically the church's attitude, and that can be seen in a letter which was written sometime before 712 by Wyrdwayz, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he wrote this letter to the Bishop of Sherborne, who was named Futhorc. Now, in this letter, Wyrdwayz, he was basically asking for Futhorc to intervene in securing the release of a Kentish slave girl called Ende, who was apparently of aristocratic ranking. As I've said, even if you were an aristocrat, you could end up in slavery, and indeed it is thought that Bēoþ was of aristocratic stock, just to add that in. But this young slave girl, this aristocratic Kentish slave girl called Ende, was being held in a state of slavery by the Bishop of Glastonbury. And he didn't want to give her up. Obviously, she was something he was rather proud of, and he really didn't want to give this slave girl up. Now, we can actually find out a fair amount of slavery from a will which was written by a woman called Wēsaþ, and which survives to this day. And this will, written on a single piece of paper, it shows how slaves, to a Christian, the slaves could be used as currency to buy you a place in heaven. Now, this Wēsaþ was an extremely wealthy woman. She had 7 estates across Dorset, Somerset, Hampshire and Wiltshire. Now, the running of these estates and the wealth generated was only possible, as I've said, slaves supported the economy and made the rich people richer, and it was only possible for her to run these 7 estates due to the sheer number of slaves that she had. She even had the power to enslave people. Now, as I've said before, it's apparent from this will that slavery was a hereditary status. So as I said, if a slave gave birth, the child was automatically a slave, hence the Old English word thealboren. Now this will, it was written quite late in the Anglo-Saxon period, around 940. It names a number of slaves and states what is to happen to them after Wēsaþ's death. Now a fair few of them are to be freed after her death, presumably as an act of piety, which is designed to secure her, Wēsaþ, a place in the heavenly realm, because it states, "And if there be any penally enslaved man besides these whom she has enslaved, she trusts to her children that they will release him for her soul's sake." So clearly, whilst us modern people hopefully find the concept of slavery completely abhorrent and evil, this was not the case in those days, to the point where a slave, whilst useful during the owner's lifetime, could also become useful when they died by being used as currency to make them look better in the eyes of their God. Though this line within the will does make me think that on some deep level these people knew that slavery was inherently wrong, but it was such a very ingrained and socially accepted part of society that they didn't think about it. Well, we'll actually never know what their inner thoughts were on the concept of slavery, but certainly it was such an accepted part of their society that it went on unquestioned. So, I do believe that this concludes my look at the Anglo-Saxon Rune Wen, both the joyous aspects and the flip side, the not so joyous, the sorrowful, pitiful sides of that state. Now, next, I am moving on to speak about the Anglo-Saxon rune hale, and I will be back shortly, hopefully, before it gets too much colder, with that rune. I'm going to be talking about some pretty interesting things on that one. I might even be talking about the great Futhorc. We shall see. But for now, all I have to say is thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate your support. Please like, please subscribe. Let's get this little channel growing, shall we? It's lovely to hear your comments, and as I said earlier, you can support me if you so wish through Patreon or by buying me a coffee. And I think I'm going to go home, warm up and have a coffee of my own now. So all that remains to be said now is farewell and bēoþ hale.